I was never supposed to be like this. That is the first thought I remember forming clearly, sometime around the age of 7, when my father stood over me with that expression on his face. Not anger, which I could have survived, but something far more corrosive. Disappointment. Cool, measured, surgical disappointment, wielded the way a scalpel is wielded, with precision and without mercy. Recessive, he had said, holding my designation test results in his hand, the paper trembling slightly at the edges from the air conditioning in his office. He had read the results standing up, as if sitting down to absorb news like this was something he refused to dignify. My son is a recessive alpha. He never said it to me directly. He said it to the room the way powerful men talk, as though the world itself is their audience. My name is Ojiho. I am 27 years old. I have what people generously call delicate features. Sharp cheekbones that taper into a softly rounded jaw, pink lips that look borrowed from someone gentler, and short tousled brown hair that never quite lies flat no matter how much product I use. I have been told I am beautiful in the way that makes people uncomfortable saying it to my face, because beautiful doesn't feel like the right word for a man, especially not for an alpha. And that is precisely the point, isn't it? In the world I was born into, dominance is currency. A dominant alpha walks into a room and the air shifts. Omegas turn instinctively, drawn by pheromone and biology, and other alphas read the hierarchy in the spine and the shoulders and the set of the jaw. Dominant alphas built the companies, ran the governments, married strategically and bred strong. They were the architecture of society, load-bearing walls made of pride and testosterone. Recessive alphas like me were tolerated. We had the designation on paper, we could still produce pheromones, still theoretically bond, but we were quieter. Our biology was considered diluted, unfinished. The whisper category that powerful families tried to breed out quietly across generations. My father, O Dae-sung, CEO of O Pharmaceuticals, was a dominant alpha of the highest order. My mother, before she left, before she decided that a life with a man who measured love and performance metrics was not worth staying for, was a recessive beta. My father had called that marriage a miscalculation. He never called it love. So I spent the better part of my life building. Not a home, not relationships. An architecture of control and power that could stand parallel to any dominant alpha. I exercised until my body was carved into something hard and immovable. I studied until my mind was a razor. I graduated top of my class from Seoul National University's business program, took over the marketing division of a competitor firm at 24, and by 26 I was running my own consulting company with a client list that made my father's secretaries nervous when they read it. I never needed a bond. I never needed a partner. I never needed anyone to look at me and feel the pull of instinct because I had built something better than instinct. I had built reputation. And then, on a Thursday night in October, I slept with someone I shouldn't have, and everything began to fall apart. It started with nausea. Not the sharp, dramatic nausea of food poisoning or flu, but something quieter and stranger. A low, persistent roll in my stomach that arrived each morning like an unwanted visitor who had apparently decided to move in. I attributed it to stress. I had a quarterly report due, 3 client dinners in 1 week, and a contract negotiation that was running 3 rounds longer than it should have. Stress made physical sense. Then came the sensitivity. I noticed it first in the office, on a morning when J1, my assistant, came in wearing a different cologne than usual. Something warm and cedar adjacent, and it hit me like a physical thing, not unpleasant but overwhelming in a way that made my breath catch and my hands still over my keyboard. Sir? Are you all right? J1 asked, pausing in the doorway. Fine, I said. Change your cologne. He looked startled. Yes of course. I dismissed it. I dismissed the next 5 mornings of nausea too. I dismissed the way my skin felt strange, oversensitive in ways I didn't have language for, how perfumes and food smells were arriving at twice their usual volume. I dismissed the exhaustion, which was profound and embarrassing, and I dismissed the way I had found myself standing in my kitchen at 11 at night, eating crackers and honey over the sink with tears tracking silently down my face for absolutely no reason I could identify. I did not dismiss it when I woke on a Wednesday morning and my suppressants, the ones I had been taking for 3 years to manage my already quiet pheromone output, to keep myself from smelling like what I was, had stopped working entirely. I could smell it on myself. Sweet, warm, something that should not have been physically possible. And omegas preheat pheromones. I sat on the edge of my bed for a very long time. Then I called my doctor, Dr. Shin, who ran the blood tests I asked for, and who called me back 4 hours later in a voice I'd never heard from her before, careful and slow, the way doctors sound when they are assembling the wreckage of your understanding of yourself into something presentable. "Jiho-sasai," she said. "I think you need to come in." "Tell me now," I said. Pause. "Your secondary sex hormone profile has shifted significantly. Your alpha hormones are suppressed to a level that is, it's very unusual. Your body appears to be undergoing a designation transition, and the markers I'm seeing are consistent with. With what? Another pause. Longer. With an omega presentation. A full one. I hung up. Then I sat very still for approximately 10 minutes, and then I stood up, put on my coat, and walked out of my apartment into the cold October air, and I walked for 2 hours without a destination because the alternative was staying inside with the truth. By the time I came back, I had made a decision. I needed answers that Dr. Shin couldn't give me. I needed a geneticist, the best one I could find. Someone who understood designation biology at a molecular level, who could look at what was happening inside me and explain it and, more importantly, fix it. I needed, of all the people on this earth, Min Kong. Min Kong and I had a history the way certain wounds have histories. You knew exactly when they happened, you remembered the specific sensation of them opening, and they had never quite healed right. We met at Hansung Academy, an elite secondary school in Gangnam that served the children of people who had too much money and too much pride to send their offspring anywhere else. Min Kong transferred in our second year. He was quiet in the way that powerful things are quiet. Not small, not humble, but contained. Conserving something. He was a dominant alpha. I had known it before anyone told me, before we even spoke, because that was how dominant alphas worked. You felt them before you understood why. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a stillness about him that commanded the room without effort. Black hair, always a little overgrown above his forehead. Dark, assessing eyes that watched everything and gave away nothing. And brilliant, insufferably, infuriatingly brilliant, in exactly the subjects I had worked hardest to master. Before we dive into this heartwarming, emotional, slow-burn romance Omegaverse story, note, this is an original work of Milliflex channel. If seen in another channel that is not Milliflex, please report that channel for copyright and impersonation. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Now let's dive in. We were ranked first and second in our class for 3 years. The rankings switched back and forth between us like a pendulum. I would take first. You would take first. We never spoke directly about it, but we spoke around it constantly, in the tight, controlled way of two people who had decided that the other one was their measuring stick. I hated him for being effortlessly what I had to fight to become. In our final year, during the national science competition, one of the most important academic events of our high school careers, Min Kong had presented his genetics research project. It was extraordinary, the kind of work that belonged in a university lab, not in a high school gymnasium. I had watched him present and felt something I still cannot name precisely. Envy, admiration, fury, and underneath all of it, something warmer that I had immediately buried. I came in second that year. He came in first. He had looked at me afterward, not gloating, just studying, those dark eyes moving over my face with the same clinical attention he gave everything, and said simply, "Your methodology was better. Your conclusion was weak." I had walked away without answering. We hadn't spoken since. That was 9 years ago. Now I was standing in front of the lobby directory of Bionex Research Institute, reading the name Dr. Min Kong, Director of Genetic Designation Studies, Lab 14, 4th floor, and I was arguing internally with myself about whether my dignity could survive asking this man for help. My body's answer apparently was yes. The nausea was back. My skin felt 3 degrees too warm. Whatever was happening inside me had moved from strange to urgent, and I didn't have the luxury of pride. I pressed the elevator button for the 4th floor. The receptionist outside Lab 14 looked me over with professional courtesy and asked if I had an appointment. "Tell him it's OG Ho," I said. "He'll see me." She raised an eyebrow. "I'm not certain." "Tell him." A minute later, she was leading me through the frosted glass doors. Min Kang's lab was exactly what I would have expected. Organized to a degree that bordered on obsessive, white boards covered in notation I recognized as genetic sequencing charts, multiple monitors running what appeared to be simulation models. He was standing with his back to me when I entered, reading a printed report with his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He turned. 9 years had done things to him. Good things, the kind of things that were deeply inconvenient for me to notice. He was broader now, the line of his shoulders filling out his lab coat with an authority that hadn't been there at 17. His jaw was sharper. The overgrown hair was still there, and so were the dark, assessing eyes, and they landed on me with the same attention, the same stillness, and something that might have been surprise before he contained it. "Jiho," he said. "Not Jiho SSI. Just my name, plain, like he'd been saying it the whole time I'd been gone." "I need your help," I said. The words tasted terrible. "Something is happening to me biologically and I need a geneticist who knows designation transition theory. Your work on recessive designation suppression is the most current research in the field." I held his gaze. "I'm not here because I want to be. I'm here because you're the best option." A beat of silence. Then Min Kong set down his report. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me everything." I told him almost everything. I told him about the nausea, the sensitivity, the suppressant failure, the blood work results that Dr. Shin had run. I told him about the pheromone shift, the exhaustion, the crying over crackers and honey, which I delivered flatly, without inflection, daring him to comment. He didn't. He listened the way he always had, completely, without interrupting, taking in information with the careful attention of someone who understood that every detail was data. What I didn't tell him initially was about the one-night stand. "I'll need my own blood panels," he said when I finished. "Comprehensive hormone assay, genetic sequencing of your secondary designation markers, pheromone profile over 48 hours. It will take a few days for the full results." He looked at me steadily. "Are you still taking suppressants?" "They stopped working." "Then don't take them while the tests are running. I need clean readings." He paused. "You should also know this will require multiple visits. I won't have answers in a single session, and I won't speculate without data." "I'm aware of how research works," I said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile but adjacent to one. "Still the same," he said quietly as though to himself. "What?" "Nothing." He stood and reached for a sample collection kit. "Roll up your sleeve." The first touch of his fingers against my inner arm was clinical and brief. I looked at the wall while he worked, at a framed journal cover, one of his publications. I recognized the title, and focused on keeping my breathing even. His pheromones were close now. Warm, dark amber, winter cedar, overwhelmingly alpha, and my body responded to them in a way that made me furious at myself. A low, involuntary pull somewhere deep and embarrassing that I shut down with the ferocity of someone closing a door against the cold. "Does it hurt?" he asked. "No. You're holding your arm like it does." "It doesn't." He finished the draw, pressed a cotton swab to the crook of my elbow, and held it there for a moment longer than necessary. I looked down to tell him it was fine and found him already looking at me, and for just a second neither of us moved, and the lab felt very quiet. "I owe you an apology," he said. "From school." I blinked. "What?" "What I said after the competition. That your conclusion was weak." "It wasn't. He paused, chose his words. "I was competitive and unkind, and you didn't deserve that." I stared at him for a long moment. Of all the things I had prepared myself for walking into this lab today, an apology from Min Kong had not been on the list. "It was 9 years ago," I said. "That doesn't mean it didn't matter." I looked away. "Run your tests," I said. "That's all I need from you right now." The test took 4 days. During those 4 days, I came to the lab each morning, gave samples, submitted to pheromone monitoring, and sat in the consultation room while Min Kang's team ran data. And each day Min Kang and I talked, first about the research, the clinical details, and then gradually about other things. He asked me about my company. I told him more than I intended to. He told me about his research, about the grant funding he'd fought for, about a paper he'd published 2 years ago that had been controversial enough to cost him 2 colleagues. He talked about designation biology the way other people talked about art, with genuine, unguarded love for the subject, and despite myself I found that I was listening not just for information but because his voice was doing something to the room, making it warmer. On the 3rd evening we stayed late. His team had left. The lab was quiet except for the hum of equipment and the soft sound of soul traffic 15 floors below, and somewhere between reviewing the preliminary data and a dinner that had arrived because neither of us had eaten, the careful distance between us began to close. It was me who closed it technically, though I still believe he had been moving too slowly for days. We were side by side at his workstation and he reached across me to point to something on the screen, and his arm brushed mine and I turned and he was very close and his pheromones hit me like something inevitable, warm amber, cedar, alpha, and I watched his gaze drop to my mouth and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in a very long time. "What?" "Jiho," he said. "Oh, a warning maybe or a question." "I know," I said. "We should." "I know," I said again, and then I kissed him. It was not gentle, the first one. It was 9 years of measuring myself against him, of being infuriated and impressed and drawn toward him across every distance I had built. He made a sound low in his throat and his hand came to my jaw, tilting my face, and then he was kissing me back and it was nothing like the clinical, careful way he did everything else. It was consuming, thorough, deep, his mouth moving against mine with a hunger that suggested he'd been building toward this for longer than 4 days. We ended up in the small adjoining office. I'm not going to pretend it was accidental. Min Kong pressed me back against the desk with his body, his hands framing my face, and kissed me until I stopped thinking about anything that wasn't the warm, solid weight of him. I pulled at his lab coat, his shirt, and he laughed softly against my mouth. A real laugh, unguarded, and something in my chest cracked open a little at the sound. "Are you sure?" he asked, forehead pressed to mine, both of us breathing harder than was dignified. "I've never been less sure of anything," I said honestly. But yes. He made love to me the way he did everything, with complete attention, thorough and unhurried, as though my body were something worth studying and also something worth worshipping. His hands were careful at first, then less so when I made it clear that careful was not what I wanted. He pressed his mouth to my throat and my collarbone and the soft inside of my wrist, and when he finally settled between my thighs and I felt the thick, heavy press of his length against me, I pulled him closer instead of away. Min Kong, I breathed. I know, he said softly. I've got you. He entered me slowly, inexorably, and the sensation of fullness, of being stretched and held and filled, broke something open in me that I hadn't known was closed. I dug my fingers into his shoulders and pressed my face into his neck and felt his pulse against my cheek as he began to move, and the pleasure that built was not separate from the emotion. They were the same thing, rising together, and by the time I fell apart in his arms I was shaking with more than just release. He gathered me against his chest afterward and held me without speaking for a long time, his hand moving in slow circles on my back, and I let him, which should have told me everything I needed to know about the state I was in. I left before morning. He didn't stop me, but he held my wrist for a moment at the door. Ji-ho. The results, I said. Tell me when you have them. He let me go. The call came 6 days later. Come in, he said. I have your results. All of them. I wore a suit. I don't know why I noted that, except that it felt important, like armor. I sat in the consultation chair across his desk and watched his face and tried to read his expression. But Min Kong had always been impossible to read when he was controlling himself. He placed the report in front of me. Your alpha designation is recessive to a degree I've rarely seen outside of academic literature, he said. Your alpha hormones were already functioning at baseline levels that are, statistically speaking, at the extreme low end of the alpha range. More relevant is the genetic composition. He paused and leaned forward slightly. Ji-ho, you have a rare expression of the OMGV7 gene cluster. It's a recessive genetic variant that can cause late-onset designation transition under specific biological triggers, usually a significant hormonal event. Another pause. Like unprotected bonding contact with a highly dominant alpha. The silence was very loud. Our night together, I said. He held my gaze. Yes. You triggered it. Your biology was already predisposed. I was a catalyst. He exhaled slowly. Your alpha genes were too weak. They were already losing ground to suppressed omega markers that your body has been carrying dormant since birth. The hormonal shift from our night together accelerated the transition. Your body is no longer producing dominant hormones. It is fully producing omega hormones. I looked at the report in my hands. The numbers were orderly and clinical. They told the story of my body deciding, at 27 years old, to become something I had spent my entire life refusing to be. There's no reversal, I said. It wasn't a question. Designation transition of this kind is permanent. The OMGV7 expression cannot be reversed without genetic editing that carries risks I wouldn't recommend. He watched me carefully. Ji-ho, are you all right? I laughed. Came out strange. No, I said. I'm not. I set the report down. I need a moment. He was quiet. He let me have it. I sat in that chair in my good suit and breathed for a long time, and I thought about my father and what he would say. I thought about my company, my clients, the reputation I had built like a fortress. I thought about the word omega and what it meant in the world I lived in, the way it was both desired and diminished, how omegas were beautiful and wanted and also consistently underestimated, consistently reduced to their biology. I thought about everything I had built to prove I was more than my designation, and how ironic it was that my designation had changed while I wasn't paying attention. And then I thought about sitting in Min Kang's arms in the dark of his office, shaking and held, feeling something I hadn't felt in so long I had forgotten it had a name. Say, Min Kang, I said. Yes. I looked up. His expression, usually so controlled, so measured, had come undone slightly at the edges. He was watching me with something raw and careful in his eyes, and I realized that whatever this was for me, it was also something for him. There's something else, he said quietly. There's another result I need to tell you about. My stomach dropped. He slid a second page across the desk. I picked it up. Read it. Read it again. I'm pregnant, I said. It wasn't a question either. 6 weeks, he said. The transition and the conception appear to have occurred simultaneously. Your body was completing its omega emergence when... He stopped. Cleared his throat. When we were together. Omega fertility during transition is extremely high. I didn't. Another stop. I didn't know. If I had known your designation state I would have. You would have stopped? I asked. My voice came out quieter than I intended. He met my eyes. No, he said. But I would have been more careful. I should have been more careful regardless. Pause. Ji-ho. I'm sorry. I looked down at the page in my hands. At the hormone levels, the cell markers, the faint clinical notation that translated in plain language to a life beginning. Something that was half mine and half his, existing in the body I apparently no longer fully understood. I was terrified. And underneath the terror, pushing up through it like something persistent and green, was something I didn't have a name for yet, but that felt like wonder. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. I told my father first because I believed that doing the most difficult thing immediately was always better than letting it accumulate. He sat behind his desk. The same office, the same expression, and I watched him take in each piece of information like he was filing it away somewhere cold. Recessive, he said. And now an omega. Now an omega, I confirmed. And pregnant. The silence stretched. I'm not asking for anything from you, I said before he could speak. I'm not asking for approval or money or your name attached to any of this. I came here because I thought, after 27 years, you deserved to hear it from me directly. I stood. I won't be back unless you decide that what you feel for me is something closer to love than to performance review. The door is open from my side. I'll leave the rest to you. I left before my voice could crack. It cracked in the elevator. I pressed the back of my hand to my mouth and breathed through it and told myself it didn't matter, told myself I had built a life that didn't require his validation, and I mostly believed it, but mostly isn't entirely, and the remaining fraction of me that still wanted my father to see me felt, for a long moment, devastatingly young. Min Kong was waiting outside the building. He'd driven me there. I hadn't asked him to wait, but he had. How did it go? He asked. I looked at him. This man I had resented and measured myself against for 9 years, who had apologized to me in a laboratory and kissed me in the dark and held my blood test results in his careful hands and told me the truth with his eyes before his mouth caught up. This man who had apparently been in love with me since we were 17, which he admitted on a Tuesday night over cold takeout in his lab, quietly and without drama, like it was simply a fact that had always been there waiting to be said. It went badly, I said. And I don't care. He opened the car door for me without comment, and when I was inside and the door was closed and he was around the car and behind the wheel, he reached across and took my hand and held it without saying anything, and I looked out the window at the Seoul skyline and felt the unfamiliar radical sensation of being held without being managed. Min Kong and I moved carefully. We were not a natural fit in the conventional sense. Two strong-willed, deeply private, professionally accomplished people who had spent our formative years sharpening ourselves against each other. There were arguments. Real ones, not the polished academic disagreements of before but the raw, personal kind that came from two people learning how to be soft with each other. You don't tell me when you're struggling, he said once, standing in my kitchen at midnight, arms folded, jaw tight. You let it build until it comes out as anger and then you shut me out. You analyze everything instead of feeling it, I shot back. You retreat into data when things get emotional. You did it last week during the appointment. You went clinical because you didn't know how to sit with the fear. A long, charged silence. Yes, he said. You're right. I blinked. You're right, he repeated. I'm telling you you're right and that I will work on it. And I need you to tell me when things are hard. Not because I can fix them, but because I want to be the person you're telling. I crossed the kitchen and pressed my face against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around me, and that was one argument that ended well. The physical between us was its own language. There were gentle evenings when he kissed my throat and my collarbone and the growing curve of my abdomen with a reverence that made my eyes sting. There were nights that were not gentle at all, when I needed to feel wanted rather than handled, and he understood the difference, gave me what I asked for with his hands and his mouth and the warm, devastating press of his length against and then inside me until I was undone and remade and held together. You're extraordinary, he told me one night, propped above me, hair disheveled, voice low and wrecked. His hand was pressed flat against my stomach where our child was growing. Do you know that? You're biased, I said. Completely, he agreed. Still true. I kissed him to stop myself from crying, which he saw through entirely. Society had opinions, of course. An alpha to omega transition was rare enough to attract academic attention. Min Kong was already fielding requests from researchers who wanted access to my case data, all of which he declined on my behalf with a precision that I found both touching and slightly terrifying in its efficiency. The gossip circuit of our social world was less scholarly but more relentless. My clients were largely unaffected. I had built the company on results, and results don't care about your secondary designation. Some clients were uncomfortable. I lost 2 of them. I replaced them within a month, and one of the replacements was a contract 3 times the size of what I'd lost. The harder part was the internal world. The mirror. I had spent 27 years building an identity around being an alpha. A recessive, underestimated, constantly proving alpha, but an alpha nonetheless. My sense of self was built on that framework the way a house is built on a foundation, and now the foundation had changed, and I had to discover whether the house could stand on different ground or whether I needed to build something new entirely. What I found, slowly and then all at once, surprised me. The softness I had always been ashamed of, the sensitivity, the depth of feeling that I had spent years armoring over, had not been weaknesses sneaking in from some foreign source. They had been mine, always, expressions of the omega designation that had been dormant in my cells since the beginning, waiting with the patience of biology. The strength I had built, the discipline, the precision, the work ethic, the refusal to be underestimated, that hadn't gone anywhere. It was still mine. It had never been the property of my designation. It had been the property of my will. I was an omega. I was 27 years old. I was 3 months pregnant with the child of a man who had been driving me quietly mad for almost a decade, who made me feel safer than I had ever felt, who apologized when he was wrong and said I was extraordinary in the dark with his hand pressed to my stomach. I was, against all odds, happy. Not the careful, defended happiness of someone who has built their life to minimize loss. Real happiness. The kind that knows it is fragile and chooses to exist anyway. In this society, Min Kong said one evening, 2 alphas loving each other is, the phrase they use is biologically incompatible. We were on the couch in his apartment. My things had migrated here gradually, in the unstated way that cohabitation begins before it's acknowledged. His arm was around my shoulders. My feet were tucked under me, and my stomach was visibly rounded now, pressing gently against the soft sweater I'd started wearing because my old fitted shirts were beginning to resist me. You were an alpha when I said. I know. Pause. The designation laws were built for alphas bonding with omegas and betas bonding with betas. 2 alphas in a relationship violated the biological hierarchy. Except now. I'm not an alpha anymore. No, he said softly. You're not. I thought about this. About the fact that the world's objection to us had technically resolved itself through my body's own transformation, without our input or intention. It felt both convenient and deeply ironic, and underneath the irony was something that stung slightly, the question of whether we would have been allowed to love each other if I had remained what I was. Would it have mattered to you? I asked. If I had stayed an alpha? Min Kong was quiet for a long time. His thumb moved in slow circles against my shoulder. I've been in love with you since we were 17, he said finally. In the years since then, I told myself it wasn't practical, that it wasn't allowed, that you would never look at me as anything except a rival. I built walls. He paused. But if you had come to my lab still an alpha, still exactly who you were before any of this, Jiho, I would have loved you just as much and it would have been harder and it would have been worth every difficulty. He turned to look at me. The designation was never the point. You were always the point. I looked at his face in the warm lamplight, steady, honest, the eyes that had watched me for so many years, and I felt the last locked room inside me open quietly and I let it. I love you, I said. It was the first time I'd said it. The words came out steadier than I expected. His expression shifted, the control softening, and then he kissed me, not urgently, not hungrily, but slowly, thoroughly, the kind of kiss that is less a beginning and more an arrival, settling into the present tense of something that intends to stay. I know, he said against my mouth, and I felt him smile. I've been waiting for you to say it. I pulled back. You knew. I hoped. Pause. Also, you look at me like you're trying to decide whether to argue with me or eat me, and I've learned to tell the difference. I pressed my face into his shoulder to hide my expression and felt his laugh vibrate through his chest, and outside the apartment window's soul sparkled cold and bright, and I thought, with the quiet amazement of someone who had not expected to arrive here, that this is what it felt like. This exact thing. Our son was born on a Wednesday morning in late April. He arrived in a warm room with pale light and Min Kang's hand in mine, steady as everything about him was steady, and when they placed the baby against my chest, small and astonishingly warm, faintly pink, already scowling in the way that Min Kang scowled when he was concentrating, something happened in my chest that I still don't have adequate language for. Not joy exactly, though it was that. Not love exactly, though it was most certainly that too. Something that contained all of those things and was also something else, a recognition. As if every choice I had made and everything that had been done to me and every impossible, terrifying turn of the last year had been arranged, with cruel precision and breathtaking elegance, to bring me to this exact room, this exact moment, with this exact warm weight against my chest and this exact man pressing his forehead against my temple and breathing unsteadily. Hello, I said to the baby, and my voice cracked immediately and I didn't try to stop it. Our son turned his face toward my voice, as small and sure as a compass finding north, and Min Kang made a sound next to me that I had never heard from him before, a completely unguarded, devastated, grateful sound, and he pressed his lips to my hair and held us both and none of us were crying, except we absolutely all were. Min Kang named him Min Ji-won. My name and his name and mine. An argument I had started and lost immediately because he had looked at me and said simply because he is both of us, and I had not found a counter to that. My father came to the hospital. I hadn't expected him. He stood in the doorway of the room with his coat still on, holding a gift bag from the kind of expensive department store that was his only language of care, and he looked at me in the hospital bed and at Min Kong standing at my shoulder and at the small bundle in my arms, and something happened in his face that I had never seen before in 27 years. He looked, very briefly, like a man who understood that he had done something wrong. "He's beautiful," my father said. His voice was rough. "He is," I agreed. A long silence. Min Kong was very still beside me, present, watchful, giving me the space to run this as I needed to. "Ji Hoa," my father said, the informal address coming out like something he'd been carrying for a long time. He stopped. Started again. "I have not been a good father." "No," I said. "You haven't." He flinched, then nodded. "I know." He looked at the baby. "May I?" I held my son out. My father crossed the room and took him with the careful, bewildered hands of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to hold something he loved, and stood looking down at the small face, and I watched him and felt, for the first time, something soften toward him that I had been keeping hard for years. Not forgiveness, not entirely, not yet, but the beginning of a door that was neither fully open nor permanently closed. That, I thought, was something. There is a photograph on Min Kang's desk in the lab. He put it there 6 months after Ji-won was born, placed it matter-of-factly between the pheromone spectrum analyzer and the framed journal cover, as though it were simply data about the world. It's the three of us. Late summer light, a park somewhere in Mapo where we'd gone on a Sunday with no particular goal except to be outside. Ji-won is in the carrier strapped to Min Kang's chest, asleep with absolute conviction, his small fist pressed to his mouth. Min Kang is looking at the camera with that slight, controlled expression that I have learned means he is happier than he knows how to show. And I am beside them, looking not at the camera but at the two of them, and whatever is on my face is something I didn't know I was capable of wearing. I had a dream once, or perhaps it was more of a belief, entrenched and airless, that the only way to have worth was to be dominant. To push against the world until the world gave way, to present an unbreakable surface and call it strength. I had built that belief into a monument and lived inside it, and for years the monument was all I had, and I called that enough. Now I know what I didn't know then, that the things I thought were weaknesses, the sensitivity, the depth of feeling, the capacity to be moved by small things, the way I could love when I let myself, were never the enemy. They were the whole point. They were the part of me that was most fully alive. I am an omega. I am a father. I am loved by a man who has watched me carefully for 10 years and chosen me every time he had the chance, and who brings me crackers and honey at midnight without comment because he has memorized me the way scientists memorize the things they care about most. I am not what my father wanted me to be. I am not what I tried to force myself to become. I am something I could not have predicted, and something that, when I hold my son and feel Min Kang's arm find its place around my shoulder with the ease of long practice, feels more like myself than anything I have ever been. The sin my father said I had committed, being born recessive, being born soft, being born the wrong kind of alpha, was not a sin. It was a beginning. A seed of something my body had been tending quietly in its own time, waiting for the conditions to become exactly what it was always going to be. My name is Oh Ji-ho. I am 28 years old. I have pink lips and short tousled brown hair and a child who has his father's dark eyes and my stubborn jaw, and a man who loves me in a way that I have stopped being surprised by and started simply living inside of. And I am, at last, exactly enough. Ji-won fell asleep at 8:15. I know the exact time because I watched the clock above the nursery door while I held him against my chest in the rocking chair, feeling the small certain weight of him grow heavier as sleep took him. First his fists uncurling, then the tight furrow between his brows softening, then the complete, absolute surrender that only very young children and the deeply trusting can manage. He smelled like warm milk and the faint cedar of Min Kang's pheromones, which had been settling into everything in this apartment the way winter light settles into a room, quietly, pervasively, until you stopped noticing it was everywhere and simply accepted that this was what the air smelled like now. I laid him down with the practiced care of someone who has learned that the space between almost asleep and fully asleep is sacred and must not be disturbed, and I stood over the crib for a moment longer than necessary, watching his chest rise and fall. Then I turned off the nursery light and padded down the hallway toward the warm glow of our bedroom, where Min Kang was waiting. He was sitting on the edge of the bed when I came in, still in his work shirt, the dark blue one I liked, the one that made his shoulders look like a geographical feature, with his sleeves rolled up and his hair slightly out of place the way it got in the evenings when he'd been running his hand through it. He looked up when I appeared in the doorway, and the expression that moved across his face was something I still wasn't entirely accustomed to receiving. I thought I might never be. It was uncomplicated want, entirely focused, directed at me with the same complete attention he gave everything, except where his professional attention felt clinical and precise, this felt like being stood in direct sunlight. "He's down?" Min Kong asked. "He's down." He exhaled slowly, and the last of the day's held tension left his shoulders, and he held out one hand. I crossed the room and took it, and he pulled me gently toward him until I was standing between his knees, and he pressed his face to my stomach, just rested it there, eyes closed, the way he'd started doing when I was pregnant and never quite stopped, and I felt his breath, slow and warm through the fabric of my shirt. "Long day," I said softly. "Long day," he agreed into my stomach. I threaded my fingers into his hair. He made a low sound, not quite a word, and his hands came to my hips and stayed there, unhurried, the grip light. We existed in that particular stillness for a long moment, the kind that builds in good relationships the way sediment builds over time, layered and solid and carrying the history of everything that had settled there. Then he tilted his face up to look at me. "Come here," he said. He kissed me slowly at first. That was always how he started, with that deliberate, unhurried quality, as though he had all the time in the world and intended to use it. His mouth moved against mine with the warm, knowing confidence of someone who had memorized this. Had memorized me, who knew exactly what weight of pressure made my breath hitch and exactly how long he could keep the kiss soft before I lost patience with softness. Approximately 45 seconds as it turned out, which he knew and I would not admit. I kissed him harder, tilting my head, and he made a low sound against my mouth that I felt more than heard, and his hands moved from my hips to my back, pulling me closer, and then I was in his lap without entirely remembering the transition, and his arms were around me and the kiss had become something different entirely, deeper, open, his tongue moving against mine with an unhurried thoroughness that made my spine go soft. I could feel him through the thin fabric between us, the growing weight of his arousal, and I shifted deliberately, and he broke the kiss to make a sound low in his throat that I collected like currency. "Jiho," he said. A warning disguised as my name. "Min Kong," I returned in the exact tone of someone who was not going to be warned. He looked at me for a moment, dark eyes, expression barely controlled, and then he flipped us with a smooth, easy certainty that still, after all this time, made my heart do something embarrassing. I landed against the pillows with him above me, his weight settling between my thighs with a familiar particular pressure that sent warmth pooling immediately downward, and he looked down at my face with an expression that contained so many things that I couldn't separate them all. "You're so beautiful," he said. Just like that, plain without fanfare, the way he said true things. I reached up and pulled him down into another kiss rather than respond, because that was the one statement of his that I still had no stable counter to, and he knew it, and his mouth curved against mine before it opened. He undressed me carefully, methodically. Of course he did, he was Min Kong, beginning with my shirt, his fingers working each button with a patience that I personally found maddening and that I suspected he deployed intentionally. He pressed his lips to each newly revealed piece of me as he went. The base of my throat, the line of my collarbone, the center of my chest, the soft skin of my stomach where it still curved gently with the memory of carrying our son. He spent a long time there. His mouth warm against the faded silver lines that marked where my body had stretched to hold G1, and I looked up at the ceiling and felt something tight and old in my chest give way a little, as it did every time he chose deliberately to kiss those marks, as if he was making a point I never had to ask for. "Min Kong," I said softly. He looked up from my stomach, chin resting lightly just below my navel, eyes dark and steady. "You're staring at the ceiling again," he said. "I'm not." "You stare at the ceiling when you're trying not to feel something." I looked down at him. He looked back with that infuriating, accurate patience. "I'm fine," I said. "I know." He pressed another kiss, unhurried, to my stomach. "Let me make you better than fine." He moved lower. By the time he worked back up my body and settled above me, his shirt long abandoned, I had lost the last of my composure entirely. My hands were in his hair, on his shoulders, anywhere I could reach, and my breathing was embarrassingly uneven, and he was watching my face with focused, unhurried attention, his own breath not entirely steady either, a detail I catalogued with satisfaction. He kissed me again, deep and thorough, while his hand moved between us, and the sensation made me arch and pull him closer, and he groaned softly against my mouth. "Look at me," he said. I opened my eyes. His forehead was against mine, the warmth of him enveloping me entirely, and his gaze was direct and soft and everything at once. "I love you," he said. "I know," I said, and watched his expression shift into something that was almost exasperated, almost tender, entirely his. "Jiho. I love you," I said quietly. "I love you. I'm not," I exhaled. "I'm not good at saying it." Without provocation. "I know." His thumb brushed my cheek. "I don't need it constantly. Just don't make me extract it like a sample." I laughed, involuntarily, and he kissed the laugh from my mouth. Then he pressed forward, and the humor dissolved entirely. The first slow push of his length into me was what it always was. A revelation I managed to forget between times, and then remember with startling totality. The stretch of it, the fullness, the way his size always required a breath, a moment of adjustment that he gave me without being asked, stilling above me with his face pressed to my temple, waiting until the tension in my hands against his back softened. "All right," he murmured. More than I managed. He began to move. Slowly at first, deeply, the long roll of his hips pressing into me and withdrawing and pressing again in a rhythm that was built for sensation rather than urgency, the kind of pace that was meant to take something apart thoroughly rather than quickly. I felt it everywhere, in my lower spine, in the base of my throat, in the hands that I had wrapped around his shoulders, fingers pressing in as the pleasure built in slow, impossible increments. His mouth found my throat, the soft skin below my ear, and he mouthed at the junction there where an omega's bond mark would go in a formal bonding, and the sensation was electric, a full-body shudder that made him feel it through the grip of my body around him, and he exhaled sharply against my skin. "Jiho," he said. Low, wrecked, the control fraying beautifully at the edges. "Don't stop," I said. "Don't." He didn't stop. He shifted the angle, finding the place that made me bite down on my own lip to muffle the sound, and the pace changed, less deliberate now, more urgent, the precise researcher in him giving way to something more fundamental, more wanting. I pulled him closer, urged him with my hands and my hips and the low sounds I stopped trying to suppress, and he gave me what I was asking for with a thorough generosity that was, I had decided, one of the many things I loved most about him. The pleasure wound tighter with every deep thrust of his length, the weight and heat and fullness of him exactly right, exactly what I needed, and his mouth was at my ear telling me things in a low, uneven voice that the disciplined, controlled version of Min Kong would probably have considered undignified, and I absorbed every syllable with my whole body. When I came apart, it was with my face pressed into his shoulder and his name on my mouth, and the sound I made was something I only made for him, and he followed moments later with a shuddering breath and the tight, reverent clench of his arms around me, pulling me as close as physics allowed while the tremors moved through us both. Afterward, the room was warm and quiet. His heartbeat was steady under my ear. The lamp on the far side of the room was still on, throwing soft amber light across everything, and outside the window's soul hummed its permanent, distant hum, and in the nursery down the hall G1 was sleeping the absolute sleep of someone who had not yet learned to carry anything. Min Kang's hand was moving in slow, absent circles on my back. I was boneless and warm and located in my body in a way that I am only ever fully located in the immediate aftermath of this. Like all the scattered parts of me had been gathered up and returned to their proper places. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking. You think differently after. More slowly." Pause. "I like it." I tilted my head to look at him. He was looking at the ceiling, which meant he was the one feeling something now, and I filed that away. "Min Kong," I said. "Yes." "Thank you," I said. I stopped. There were too many endings to that sentence. For being in that lab. For running my tests without making me feel reduced by them. For saying my conclusion was better, eventually 9 years late. For holding my wrist at the door. For the crackers and honey. For G1's name, which I still loved. For all of it. He turned to look at me, and I could see that he understood the unfinished sentence entirely. "Thank you," he said back. Just as simply, just as full. I settled back against his chest. His arm tightened around me and the circles on my back continued, slow and sure. I thought about the photograph on his desk. The three of us, late summer light, G1 sleeping against his chest, Min Kang's almost smile, my face turned toward them both. I thought about the boy I had been, sharp and defended and quietly ashamed, building and building and building and never letting anything be enough. I thought about becoming. About the terrifying, unbidden, unmistakable grace of a body that had decided, against every plan I'd made, to become exactly what it needed to be so that I could arrive at exactly this. Here. This room. This man. This life. Nothing else was necessary. Nothing else needed to be added or proven or constructed. It was complete, the way things that have grown into their full form are complete. Not finished because we would keep going, keep building something with each day, but whole. G1 would wake in a few hours. Min Kong would go to him first because he always did, moving in the dark with the quiet certainty of someone who had decided, without discussion, that this was one of his responsibilities. I would lie in the warm absence he left and listen to the low murmur of his voice down the hallway and feel something so large and simple that it had no proper name. But that was later. Right now the lamp was warm and the city hummed and his heartbeat was steady and sure under my ear, and I closed my eyes. And I slept.